I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading The House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. We are on chapter 18 titled Under the Old Regime. There is no way we are finishing this chapter in this reading. It is a long chapter. It'll probably be like 3 readings before we get through this chapter. Let's get started. Chapter 18, Under the Old Regime. For many years before the Civil War, there had lived in the old house behind the Cedars a free-colored woman who went by the name of Molly Walden. Her rightful name, for her parents were free-born and legally married. Okay, so let's stop there. So Warwick and Rena's mom was free-born, and her parents were free-born and legally married. All right. She was a tall woman, straight as an arrow. Her complexion in youth was of an old ivory tint, which at the period of this story, time had darkened measurably. So she was ivory complexion, old ivory. Like you could tell she wasn't white, but not by much. Her black eyes, now faded, had once sparkled with the fire of youth. Her high cheekbones, straight black hair, and a certain dignified reposefulness of manner pointed to an aboriginal descent. Tradition gave her to the Negro race. Tradition gave her to the Negro race. Not her looks. Tradition. People knew her parents were black, or people knew her parents' parents were black, so clearly she was black too. Tradition. And let's keep that in mind, not just because that's how things play out, but like maybe it wasn't even right. I don't know. Doubtless she had a strain of each, with white blood very visibly predominating over both. In Louisiana or the West Indies, she would have been called a quadroon, or more loosely, a Creole. In North Carolina, where fine distinctions were not the rule in matters of color, she was sufficiently differentiated when described as a bright mulatto. Molly's free birth carried with it certain advantages, even in the South before the war. Though degraded from its high estate and shorn of its choicest attributes, the word freedom had nevertheless a cheerful sound, and described a condition that left even to colored people who could claim it some liberty of movement and some control of their own persons. They were not citizens, yet they were not slaves. No Negro, save in books, ever refused freedom. Many of them ran frightful risks to achieve it. I love that. No Negro, save in books, ever refused freedom. Because who's going to refuse freedom? Nobody. That is the stuff of fiction, and it's funny that a piece of fiction is calling out fiction. I love it when we get meta. Alright. Molly's parents were of the class, more numerous in North Carolina than elsewhere, known as Old Issue Free Negroes, which took its rise in the misty colonial period when race lines were not so closely drawn, and the population of North Carolina comprised many Indians, runaway Negroes, and indentured white servants from the seaboard plantations who mingled their blood with great freedom and small formality. And that's exactly how humans do. We hook up with people. I mean, I want to believe that we hook up with people in long-lasting marriages, and I'm not saying that these weren't, but we also just hook up with people. Who we are attracted to is who we are attracted to, and we hook up with them. And so this is saying there's a lot of indigenous people, black people, white people, all just a mixture, all getting together. And then it ended up with just a bunch of free-colored people because they were clearly not white, but they were also not clearly black. Free-coloreds. Free-colored people in North Carolina exercised the right of suffrage as late as 1835, and some of them, in spite of galling restrictions, attained to a considerable degree of prosperity and dreamed of a still brighter future when the growing tyranny of the slave power crushed their hopes and crowded the free black people upon the black mass just beneath them. So the free black people were a step up from the slaves, and restriction of their rights just lumped them in with the slaves, which I'm sure they didn't appreciate. Like if we're talking about, let's think about the minimum wage thing. People are so angry about the idea of raising the minimum wage, and they're saying, I have a degree, I'm a professional, I make $15 an hour. Why should somebody without a degree and not a professional make the same thing I make? But that's flawed thinking. They deserve to make $15 an hour, and perhaps You deserve more. But just because you're where you are doesn't mean that somebody deserves to be less than where you are. But to hang on to whatever modicum of feeling good about yourself or whatever that is that you're experiencing, you don't want what's right for other people, because it can't be right for them, because if it's right for you and you are different than they are, then that seems like inequity and lack of fairness. And I imagine that's the exact same thing that's going on here and at that time. Okay. Miss Molly's father had been at one time a man of some means. In an evil hour, with an overweening confidence in his fellow men, he endorsed a note for a white man who, in a moment of financial hardship, clapped his white neighbor on the back and called him brother. Oh no. He co-signed with a white man, believing he was helping the white man and believing the white man saw him as an equal. This is going to go down very poorly. Not poverty, but wealth is the most potent leveler. In due time, the endorser was called upon to meet the maturing obligation. This was the beginning of a series of financial difficulties which speedily involved him in ruin. He died prematurely, a disappointed and disheartened man, leaving his family in dire poverty. His widow and surviving children lived on for a little while at the house he had owned, just outside of the town, on one of the main traveled roads. By the wayside near the house there was a famous deep well. The slim barefoot girl, with sparkling eyes and voluminous hair, who played about the yard and sometimes handed water in a gourd to travelers, did not long escape critical observation. Oh no. Okay, we gotta keep reading, but I know what's gonna happen. A gentleman drove by one day, stopped at the well, smiled upon the girl, and said kind words. He came again, more than once, and soon, while scarcely more than a child in years, Molly was living in her own house, hers by deed of gift, for her protector was rich and liberal. She got swooped up by a white man who we already know didn't marry her. I mean, she was in essence a sex slave, right? I mean, they were keeping house. What is this? Sorry, I just noticed I've got a ton of notes in the back of the book. Look at that. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. A gentleman. Would a gentleman do this? What we called a gentleman sure would and did. Her mother never more knew want. Right, like this is the deal I'm making to help my family. And lots of people have made that deal, and I get it. If this is what's going to help your family, I get it. But Her mother never more knew want. Her poor relations could always find a meal in Molly's kitchen. She did not flaunt her prosperity in the world's face. She hid it discreetly behind the cedar screen, which I'm sure is what her white gentleman intended. Those who wished could know of it, for there were few secrets in Patesville. Those who chose could as easily ignore it. There were few to trouble themselves about the secluded life of an obscure woman of a class which had no recognized place in the social economy. She worshipped the ground upon which her lord walked, was humbly grateful for his protection, and quite as faithful as the forbidden marriage vow could possibly have made her. She led her life in material peace and comfort, and with a certain amount of dignity. Of her false relation to society she was not without some vague conception, but the moral point involved was so confused with other questions growing out of slavery and caste as to cause her, as a rule, but little uneasiness. And only now and then, in the moments of deeper feeling that come sometimes to all who live and love, did there break through the mists of ignorance and prejudice surrounding her a flash of light by which she saw, so far as she was capable of seeing, her true position, which in the clear light of truth no special pleading could entirely justify. So basically, she ignored the precarious nature of her situation. I get it. For she was free, she had not the slave's excuse. with every inducement to do evil and few incentives to do well, and hence entitled to charitable judgment, she yet had freedom of choice, and therefore could not wholly escape blame. Let it be said in further extenuation that no other woman lived in neglect or sorrow because of her. She robbed no one else. For what life gave her, she returned an equivalent, and what she did not pay, her children settled to the last farthing. Wow. Let it be said in further extenuation that no other woman lived in neglect or sorrow because of her. Now, her white paramour, we don't know if he had a white wife somewhere else. And a whole other white family. I'm guessing he probably did, but I don't know. But no other woman lived in neglect or sorrow because of her. So if he did have a whole other white family, they didn't know about her and her family, and because that would have been sorrow if they had known, and he was taking good care of them, because were he not, that would be neglect. She robbed no one else, so she didn't steal anybody else's man, so I guess maybe that means he didn't have another family. I don't know. For what life gave her, she returned an equivalent. So she was prosperous due to this marriage, and she took care of her whole extended family. And what she did not pay, her children settled to the last farthing. So her children suffered due to this because there are always payments that come due, and her children settled the ones that she couldn't settle herself. That's sad. And okay, so this white man loves. It's clearly not love. It might look like love and feel like love, but this isn't love. But he didn't teach her how to read? Come on. How are you going to be like, oh, here, come live with me, bear my children, I'll pay for your house, but I don't want you to have any learning. Don't read. I mean, he did teach the children. Somebody taught the children. And why didn't they teach their mom how to read? How is it that you know how to read and somebody you are close to doesn't? I don't get that. I don't get that. I'll say it one more time. I don't get that. Several years before the war, when Miss Molly's daughter Rena was a few years old, death had suddenly removed the source of their prosperity. The household was not left entirely destitute. Miss Molly owned her home and had a store of gold pieces in the chest beneath her bed. A small piece of real estate stood in the name of each of the children, the income from which contributed to their maintenance. Larger expectations were dependent upon the discovery of a promised will, which never came to light. Of course, the promised will never came to light. Miss Molly wore black for several years after this bereavement, until the teacher and the preacher, following close upon the heels of military occupation, suggested to the colored people new standards of life and character, in the light of which Miss Molly laid her mourning sadly and shamefacedly aside. She had eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. After the war, she formed the habit of church-going, and might have been seen now and then, with her daughter, in a retired corner of the gallery of the white Episcopal Church. Upon the ground floor was a certain pew which could be seen from her seat, where once had sat a gentleman whose pleasures had not interfered with the practice of his religion. Oh, so her white man was a church-going guy, and what he knew was immoral and unjust didn't interfere with his religious life. His religion had not taken hold of him. She might have had a better seat in a church where a northern missionary would have preached a sermon better suited to her comprehension and her moral needs, but she preferred the other. She was not white, alas. She was shut out from the seeming paradise, but she liked to see the distant glow of the celestial city and to recall the days when she had basked in its radiance. She did not sympathize greatly with the new era opened up for the emancipated slaves. She had no ideal love of liberty. She was no broader and no more altruistic than the white people around her, to whom she had always looked up, and she sighed for the old days, because to her they had been the good days. Now not only was her king dead, but the shield of his memory protected her no longer. Wow, so I get it, the old days were the good days to her. She had a quote-unquote husband. She was prosperous. she didn't have moral things picking at her about her situation in life. All right, we're stopping for today. Let me place my bookmark a little bit differently. And that is the first part of chapter 18 of House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda.